This is a question that sounds modern but isn't. The desire to have sex without having children is not a product of the 20th century or the sexual revolution or the invention of the pill. It is one of the oldest human desires on record. And the attempts to act on that desire, to find ways to prevent pregnancy deliberately, go back further than most people realize. Documented across cultures and time periods with a consistency that suggests this was never a marginal concern. It was a universal one. People have always wanted to control their reproduction. The specific methods they used ranged from the surprisingly effective to the genuinely alarming to the philosophically creative. Some of them worked. Some of them did not, and the history of what people tried, why they tried it, and how well it succeeded tells you a great deal about how ancient humans understood their own bodies, their environments, and the relationship between the two. Let us start with the oldest documented evidence, because it is older than most people expect. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text dating to around 1825 BCE, contains what are almost certainly the oldest written contraceptive prescriptions in existence. The recipes it describes include a pessary, essentially an internal barrier device, made from crocodile dung mixed with fermented dough to be inserted before sex. Another recipe uses a mixture of honey and natron, the sodium carbonate salt used extensively in Egyptian religious and practical contexts. Crocodile dung as a contraceptive. I want to acknowledge that before we move on. The ancient Egyptians looked at the problem of unwanted pregnancy and said, what if we used crocodile dung? And the answer from a modern chemical standpoint is that it might have actually done something. Crocodile dung is alkaline, and alkaline environments are hostile to sperm, which prefer a slightly acidic pH. The fermented dough would have added to the effect. It was not an effective contraceptive in any reliable sense, but it was not pure magical thinking either. It was an attempt to apply observed chemical logic to a biological problem using the materials available in a world where crocodiles were apparently plentiful enough to provide the raw material on a recurring basis. The honey and natron mixture was similarly not insane from a chemical standpoint. Honey has mild antimicrobial and spermicidal properties that modern research has confirmed. Natron is strongly alkaline. Neither is a reliable contraceptive, but neither is nothing. And in the context of what was available in 1825 BCE, these represented genuine attempts at evidence-based medicine applied to reproductive control. Working with the limited pharmacological toolkit of the ancient world, and trying to do something useful with it. That is more than can be said for a lot of ancient medicine. Egypt was not alone. Ancient Mesopotamian texts contain references to contraceptive preparations. Ancient Indian texts from the Ayurvedic tradition describe numerous methods for preventing conception, including oil-based preparations applied before intercourse and various herbal formulations taken internally. Ancient Chinese medical texts contain similar material. The pattern is consistent. Wherever human civilization produced written records, those records include attempts to prevent pregnancy, which means the practice almost certainly predates the writing by a significant margin. The question is how far back it goes. And the answer to that requires thinking about what kind of evidence could possibly survive from before the era of written documentation. The biological evidence from actual prehistoric populations is suggestive in an interesting way. Archaeological and skeletal studies of prehistoric populations consistently show birth spacing, the gap between births. That is longer than would be expected if women were simply becoming pregnant at maximum biological rates. Hunter-gatherer women, both in the archaeological record and in contemporary traditional societies, tend to have children spaced roughly 3 to 4 years apart rather than the theoretical maximum of 1 to 2 years. Some of this spacing is explained by extended breastfeeding, which suppresses ovulation through hormonal mechanisms. Some is explained by the relatively low body fat percentages of active hunter-gatherer women, which also affects fertility. But some of it has been attributed by researchers studying contemporary traditional societies to deliberate practices aimed at preventing or spacing pregnancies. The spacing was not entirely accidental. It was at least partly managed using whatever tools and knowledge were available. The plant world is where the most substantial and most interesting evidence lies. Across an enormous range of traditional cultures on every inhabited continent, studied by ethnobotanists and anthropologists over the past century and a half, there exists a consistent body of knowledge about plants with contraceptive, abortifacient, or fertility-affecting properties. The specific plants vary by region because the flora of sub-Saharan Africa is different from the flora of North America or Southeast Asia. But the categories of plants used and the methods of use show remarkable consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other whatsoever. This consistency is not a coincidence. It reflects the fact that plants' secondary metabolites, the chemical compounds that plants produce for their own biological purposes, including defense against insects and fungal pathogens, include a significant number of compounds that interact with mammalian reproductive systems. Plants did not produce these compounds for humans to use as contraceptives. They produce them for unrelated reasons. But the interaction with mammalian hormones and reproductive biology is real, and was discovered by human populations through observation and experimentation over very long periods of time. Somebody noticed something, they told somebody else. The knowledge accumulated generation after generation in the specific informal channels through which traditional women's medical knowledge traveled. Queen Anne's lace wild carrot Daucus carota is perhaps the most well-documented example of a plant with traditional contraceptive use across independent cultures. Seeds of wild carrot were described by Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE as a contraceptive, and continued to be used in traditional medicine in parts of South Asia today. Modern research has found that wild carrot seeds contain compounds that interfere with progesterone synthesis and implantation. And animal studies have confirmed anti-fertility effects. It is not a reliable or safe contraceptive in any modern clinical sense. The dose required for effect is close to the dose that causes toxicity. But it is not pharmacologically inert either. Something is genuinely happening at the biochemical level when you consume it in the right quantities, which is more than can be said for many of the medical treatments deployed across the ancient world. Silphium is the most dramatic example of ancient contraceptive plant use. And it is also the most tragic because it was driven to extinction by the demand it created. Silphium was a plant that grew only in a specific region of North Africa near the ancient Greek colony of Cyrene, in what is now Libya. It was described extensively by ancient authors, Hippocrates, Theophrastus, Dioscorides, Pliny the Elder, as having powerful contraceptive and abortifacient properties. And it was prized so highly that it became the primary export and economic foundation of Cyrene. Depicted on the city's coins, traded across the Mediterranean world at prices that made it one of the most valuable commodities of the ancient world. Worth its weight in silver in some accounts, worth more than gold in others. The demand for silphium, driven substantially by its reputation as a contraceptive, was apparently so intense and so sustained that it was harvested to extinction. By the 1st century CIE it was gone. The last known stock reportedly sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity. Ancient authors describe it with a specificity and consistency, the dose, the method of use, the effects. The distinction between its contraceptive and abortifacient applications at different doses. That suggests the reputation was based on actual observed efficacy rather than pure superstition or marketing. What compounds it contained and exactly how they worked is a question we cannot now answer because the plant no longer exists. An entire species was consumed into non-existence by the demand created by its own usefulness. That is a specific and somewhat extraordinary kind of tragedy. Pennyroyal, Artemisia species, pomegranate seeds, juniper berries, blue cohosh. Wild ginger, cottonroot bark, across Greek, Roman, Chinese, Indian, indigenous American, and African traditional medicine. Plants in these categories appear with consistent descriptions of fertility-affecting, contraceptive, or abortifacient properties. The pharmacological research on many of these plants has confirmed that they contain bioactive compounds with effects on reproductive hormones, implantation, or uterine function. The efficacy and safety profiles vary enormously. Some of the traditional abortifacients work partly by poisoning the mother to a degree that also terminates the pregnancy, which is as alarming as it sounds, and which ancient medical authors were sometimes genuinely aware of and documented. But the pharmacological reality underlying the traditional knowledge is real. These plants contain things that do things to reproductive biology. The ancient Greeks and Romans were particularly systematic about documenting contraceptive. And the surviving texts from these traditions are the most detailed we have from the ancient world. Soranus of Ephesus, a Greek physician practicing in Rome in the 2nd century CE, wrote a gynecological text called Gynecea that contains an extensive and remarkably organized section on contraception and abortion. His approach is notably sophisticated for the period. He distinguishes carefully between contraceptives, substances that prevent conception, and abortifacients, substances that terminate an established pregnancy, and notes that contraception is preferable to abortion both for effectiveness and for the woman's health. He describes a hierarchy of methods organized by reliability and safety, and acknowledges the trade-offs between efficacy and safety in a way that reflects genuine clinical thinking rather than simple pharmacological optimism. His recommended methods include barrier approaches, wool pessary soaked in various substances including olive oil, cedar resin, white lead, and pomegranate pulp, and oral preparations taken before or after sex. Some of his recommendations have obvious pharmacological logic that survives modern scrutiny. Olive oil and cedar resin both have spermicidal properties confirmed by modern research. Pomegranate seeds contain phytoestrogens, plant compounds that mimic estrogen, that affect the hormonal environment in ways relevant to fertility. White lead is genuinely effective at killing things including sperm, though it also kills the woman over time through lead poisoning, which represents a significant downside that Soranus apparently considered an acceptable trade-off under certain circumstances. Ancient medicine was not always characterized by what we might call a thorough long-term risk assessment. The Roman poet Ovid, writing in the 1st century BCE, mentions contraception as a common practice among the women of Rome, treating it as unremarkable and widely known rather than as a specialty medical procedure. This casual reference is itself evidence. When a poet treats something as unremarkable background detail rather than notable subject matter, it suggests the practice was common enough that the audience required no explanation. The Talmud, the central text of rabbinic Jewish law compiled over several centuries, contains extensive of contraception and its permissibility in various circumstances, including specific mention of a contraceptive device called a mock, a material inserted before intercourse to prevent conception, and oral contraceptive preparations referred to as a cup of roots. The discussion is legal and philosophical rather than purely medical. But the underlying assumption that effective contraception exists, and that the legal question is when it is permissible to use it, tells you that the methods being discussed were understood as actually working to some meaningful degree. You do not write lengthy legal argument about the conditions under which something is permitted, if that something reliably does nothing. Physical barrier methods appear across multiple ancient traditions, in ways that represent genuine engineering solutions to the same mechanical problem, in addition to the Egyptian pessary recipes and the Greek and Roman wool pessaries. There are references in various ancient texts to something functionally equivalent to a condom, coverings for the male genitals used during intercourse. Ancient Egyptians appear to have used linen sheaths, possibly for disease prevention as much as contraception, though the two functions are not mutually exclusive. There is evidence from ancient Japanese traditions of similar coverings made from tortoise shell and later from animal intestine, which sounds deeply uncomfortable in ways that go some way toward explaining why barrier contraception has historically been underutilized relative to its theoretical effectiveness. Ancient Rome saw the use of goat bladder for the same purpose. The principle was understood across multiple independent traditions, even if the specific execution varied considerably. Withdrawal. Coitus interruptus. appears so universally across traditional cultures and historical periods that it requires no particular documentation of specific ancient sources. It is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible in the story of Onan, from which it derives one of its historical names. It is described by ancient medical authors as a common practice. It is documented in virtually every traditional society ever studied across any part of the world. Its effectiveness as a contraceptive is real but imperfect. Modern estimates suggest it reduces pregnancy risk by roughly 73%, depending on consistent and correct use. Which is a range that tells you everything about how consistent and correct use varies in practice. As a freely available, cost-free, no preparation required method, its appeal across essentially the entire span of human history is self-explanatory. Lactational amenorrhea, the suppression of ovulation by extended breastfeeding, was probably the most widely used and most effective ancient contraceptive method. Though calling it a method implies a level of deliberate strategic deployment that may not always have been present in the way modern people would. Understand it, extended breastfeeding suppresses the hormonal signals that trigger ovulation. And in populations where breastfeeding was intensive and prolonged, which it was in most traditional societies, often until the child was 2 or 3 years old, this effect produced meaningful birth spacing without any additional intervention. Whether ancient populations understood the hormonal mechanism or simply observed that extended nursing tended to delay the next pregnancy is unclear. But the practical observation would have been available to any attentive person living within the community over time, and it would have been correct. Some traditional societies appear to have deliberately extended breastfeeding at least partly for its contraceptive effect, rather than purely for nutritional reasons. The anthropological evidence from contemporary traditional societies includes explicit statements from women about the contraceptive motivation for extended nursing. Whether this understanding is ancient or a more recent accumulation of community observation is impossible to determine with certainty. But the effect itself is as old as human breastfeeding, and the observation of the effect is probably nearly as old. Abstinence and sexual restriction during specific periods of the menstrual cycle appear in various ancient medical and religious frameworks as a mechanism for controlling reproduction. The concept of a fertile window, the period during which conception is possible, was understood to exist across ancient medical traditions, even if its actual timing was generally misidentified. Hippocrates believed conception was most likely immediately after menstruation, which is approximately the least fertile period of the average cycle. This meant that ancient attempts at rhythm method-style abstinence were often practiced at precisely the wrong time, providing little or no actual contraceptive benefit while creating a false sense of protection. The actual timing of ovulation, mid-cycle, roughly 2 weeks before the next menstrual period, was not correctly understood until the 20th century. For the entire span of recorded history before roughly 1930, anyone trying to use cycle timing as a contraceptive was working from information that was not just incomplete, but actively incorrect in its most important detail, the social and economic dimensions of reproductive control in ancient societies deserve more attention than they typically receive because the motivation for avoiding pregnancy was not simply personal preference. It was embedded in complex social structures that made childbearing differently weighted for different people in different circumstances. In ancient Rome, slave women had the most obvious and most urgent need for contraceptive knowledge. Pregnancy for an enslaved woman meant a child born into slavery. And the social reality of sexual violence against enslaved people made unwanted pregnancy a constant threat rather than a hypothetical one. Free women faced different but still significant pressures. Marriage was partly an economic and political alliance, in which the production of legitimate heirs was a primary social expectation. Having too many children could strain household resources. Having children in complicated circumstances. Adultery was a legal offense with severe consequences under certain periods of Roman law. Made reproductive control a practical necessity rather than a preference. Across cultures, the women most likely to have access to contraceptive knowledge, And the most pressing reasons to use it consistently were often those working in the sex trade. The hetairai of ancient Greece. The women working in the Roman brothels that were legal, regulated, and taxed institutions of Roman urban life. These women had the most consistent motivation to seek out contraceptive methods and the most persistent need for knowledge that actually worked. Some researchers have argued that the preservation and transmission of contraceptive knowledge across ancient cultures owes more to this specific population than to formal medical traditions, precisely because the practical need was so immediate and so consequential. What is the overall picture that emerges from all of this? Ancient humans were trying very hard to control their reproduction. They were doing so across every culture in every time period for which we have evidence, using the plant knowledge and physical materials and conceptual frameworks available to them. The effectiveness of what they were doing varied enormously, from the meaningfully effective lactational amenorrhea and withdrawal, to the moderately effective spermicidal barrier methods, to the pharmacologically real but unreliable herbal preparations, to the pure placebo of amulets and rituals. The knowledge was primarily held and transmitted by women, often informally, passed between mothers and daughters, and between women in the same community. It was not written down in the same way that elite male medical knowledge was written down, which means it is substantially underrepresented in the historical record, despite being more widely practiced than what the surviving texts suggest. Soranus of Ephesus wrote things down. The grandmother who told her granddaughter which plants to drink a tea from and when did not. And in terms of what people were actually doing in practice, the grandmother's knowledge was almost certainly more widely distributed and more regularly applied. The gap between what people wanted, reliable reproductive control, and what they actually had access to, a patchwork of partially effective methods with significant uncertainty about which worked and why, was a gap that persisted through essentially all of human history, and was only seriously closed by the development of modern hormonal contraception in the mid-20th century. But the desire that drove the development was not new. It was not created by modernity or the sexual revolution. It was there in the crocodile dung recipes of ancient Egypt, and the Silphium trade of the ancient Mediterranean, and the herbal knowledge passed between women in every traditional society ever studied on every inhabited continent. The desire to have sex without having children, and the willingness to take considerable risks, and deploy whatever resources were available to pursue that desire is as old as the desire to have sex itself, which given everything is about as old as it gets.